Hello. Welcome to our second lecture podcast on the history of assessment, how assessment has evolved, and how it will potentially be used today. I'm going to try to keep this brief. So in each section, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what assessment has been and how it has been used. If you have further questions, please do not hesitate to jot those down and ask me via email or in person. 2200 BC, we're looking at, this is a picture of Confucius actually, but Chinese emperors developed assessments in order to assess the people around them, right? You only wanted the best and brightest to serve as governors, to serve you, to provide advice, to follow you. You didn't want just some schlub off the street, right? So Chinese and the Greeks actually also developed different assessment measures in order to assess folks around the higher up individuals. We're going to fast forward almost 4,000 years to the 1800s. I want you to think of the 1800s as an age of industrial, especially towards the middle end, as an age of industrial revolution. Remember, what does education look like in America in this time? Typically the one-room schoolhouse, right? So children from all around surrounding communities would send their children to the one-room schoolhouse ages, 4, 5, all the way up to 9, maybe even younger. Maybe a little older, up to 12. And so the teachers at this time were masters of differentiated instruction, right? They had to assess what children knew, what they were capable of doing, and then be able to meet their needs with what they were teaching them, right? How to read, reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's what we have going on here. Now, so assessment, how is assessment being used in this time period? Assessment not only by the teacher, but towards the end of your schooling career, at the ripe old age of 9 or 12, you had to decide, and assessments helped individuals coach you on where to go. Sometimes families told you where to go, but typically children would go into the factories or they'd go back to the farms, and so assessments were really used to just kind of tell you, well, what professional life are you going to engage in over the next, over the rest of your career, rest of your life. So this kind of leads us from the age of factories, which still play a major role in the early 1900s, here to understand, so as these schools are being built over the course of the 1800s, individuals start to think, wow, we have all these children, they're in one place, we can really study them, right? So you have individuals like Charles Darwin, Jean Piaget, John Dewey, Louis Tierman, and Stanley Hall, and these folks are studying children, and what they're really interested in is intelligence. How do we measure intelligence, right? So these folks start working together, right? So Stanford Binet starts working with, Jean Binet starts working with Stanford University and so forth, and so we develop intelligence tests, and especially several are developed, not many, but several are developed for, in fact, I think it's Louis Tierman who works for the United States government. So we're developing, and other countries are developing intelligence tests in order to sift who is an officer in the Army and who is a grunt. Think about it. World War I, one of the bloodiest wars in the history of the world, besides perhaps the Civil War in American soil. But you have trench warfare, you have people just mustard gas, people are losing limbs left and right, and things like that. So who do you want out there in the fields, and who do you want directing those people in the fields? And so we're using assessment in order to decide who is more intelligent, who is our officer, and who is our grunt in the field. So once again, just 1916 through 1918 and so forth. World War I is 1914 to 18. So 1916 to 18, we have a lot of intelligence tests happening. By the 1920s, we're all living in the age of the normal curve. And figuring out, we're trying to separate people, right? Who is more intelligent than others? And so you actually see, by 1920, you see the birth of the SAT, right? So think of it this way: war ends, and the factories are still going, but we've figured out that there are lots of intelligent people, so they could go to college, right? So how do the Ivies decide who they want in their colleges, right? Ivy Leagues, right? And so they work together. So you have, SAT is the Stanford achievement test. In fact, the SAT is not an achievement; it's an aptitude test, and it more functions on a basis of the abilities, intellectual abilities of folks. And so this is how assessment is being used as a gatekeeping measure to keep individuals out of certain institutions, and also allowing certain individuals in, right? Here's your overview, and please don't hesitate to pause and make notes of whatever you need to do. After World War II, you start to get into an international scheme that kind of works towards, if you know the picture here, it's not some sort of crazy mouse, it is actually Sputnik, right? And so internationally, what the United States is trying to do is they're trying to be the first to space, right? And it doesn't work out, right? So 1958, Sputnik is launched, and they have a satellite, the Russians have a satellite, and, we're in the midst of the Red Scare and nuclear weapons and so forth. And so when the United States doesn't make it to space first, who do we blame? Well, we blame the poor kids, right? So the idea is that the United States wants to raise up, in the 1950s, we want to raise up the level of quality for all children, because it's the poor kids' fault that we don't have enough people to be able to figure out how to get to space first, right? So let's develop Head Start and declare a war on poverty, right? So in the 1950s, you have all this money going into Head Start programs. You have development of Title I programs, other bilingual programs. Home Start is developed later on. And so, at this time, you also have to remember, you also have Brown versus Board of Education happening. So you go from this idea of de jure segregation of schools, where it's legal for schools to segregate, and you move into an era of desegregated schools, but you also, now at least, especially, you can look around, it's something we would refer to as de facto segregation. So people tend to group together based on race, ethnicity, class, social class. And so these are really the roots of the issues that we are facing today, right? Well, they also continued to face those issues previously. So assessment was used in the 1950s and 60s So although the schools were desegregated de jure, assessments were becoming utilized by schools to kind of create the de facto segregation that we see now, right? So kids couldn't get into certain schools, right? You develop private schools so that children had to test into schools. We develop a magnet system, for example, in Cincinnati public schools with tests so that, only certain kids could get into those schools. Now, so desegregation, civil rights, 1965 Civil Rights Act, and so forth, these sorts of things, they do a lot for raising social consciousness and awareness, but they don't do a lot for changing the social landscape in school, right? So by the 1980s, early 1980s, there's a famous report called A Nation at Risk that's put out. And this came out right at the beginning of international comparative assessments and tests, right? So there are things called the PISA, for example, or the TIMSS test that compare internationally. So we look at literacy and science and math amongst children in all these different countries, right? And the National Commission on Excellence in Education finds that we are still back in the 1950s. And you have to remember, in the early 1980s, you have Reagan coming in, you have a renewed scare from the USSR, which is soon broken up. However, the problems are from the assessments that people are looking at in the larger government and throughout the world are saying education is the problem. We are not educating children well enough, once again. And this is, so what do? We start to look at how do we teach children with disabilities, right? So let's create an act to make sure that we are teaching children with disabilities that they receive free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And this starts to sound like IDEA, right? And all of the reauthorizations of IDEA. So we've already looked at poor kids, and we said, oh, it's the problem with the poor kids, and so now we know everyone's living on this normal curve. So let's look at those kids 2 standard deviations below the normal curve and our students with disabilities, and really focus our attention efforts there. By 2001, this becomes exacerbated in the development of No Child Left Behind, which we know as the era of accountability, right? So accountability happened previously. A Nation at Risk kind of ushered that era in, but No Child Left Behind takes this a step further and says, if teachers do not, we have all these tests now. Let's implement testing from 3rd through 8th grade and in the high school, and we can assess the progress that children are making in our schools. And remember, Bush famously said, by 2013, 95% of children will be reading at grade level, right? That was the 3rd grade reading test. Well, we've passed 2013, and it definitely didn't happen, right? So accountability ushered in a new era of testing for those grades, the 3 through 8 in high school. However, and accountability of teachers, accountability of school districts, school report cards started coming out, all those sorts of things. And so what assessment has done in this era is to kind of continue the segregation, the de facto segregation. So now we can look on school report cards and say, hey, I want to send my child to this school, or I want to live in this school district or not. And so these things continue ideas that were happening in the 1950s. So in 2015, if you didn't know it or not, the ESSA was the reauthorization. So remember, NCLB, ESSA, and these were reauthorizations of the same Elementary and Secondary Education Act from 1965. So these bills provide funding for schools. and they provide the template and the direction that schools should take. The ESSA, what's different about that, what Obama had focused on was early childhood education, and that's us, right? And here we are really focusing on preschool education, so preschool scores. So if a school district has a preschool associated with it for 4-year-olds, those scores will now have to be reported in the school report card. He's focusing on the transition to kindergarten, so we want to look at kindergarten readiness, and we're also, with the ESSA, we're going to put a lot of money into early childhood education development, teacher growth, and research. So this is really the era of a renewed focus on early childhood education, and so you're lucky, I would say. Here again is kind of an overview of what I was talking about, and I'll try to wrap up here, 15 minutes. This history might have left you with more questions than answers, and that's totally good. So I'll leave an opening discussion board perhaps for questions and try to get to them as soon as possible, and then but you also have the opportunity to talk with me in class when we get back next week. Thanks, and have a great day.